Welcome to The Big Picture with Katrina Fulcher-Rude and Anny Castilla-Earls, where they discuss how research in speech-language pathology can be implemented in daily clinical practice. Hi everyone, and welcome back to The Big Picture. I'm Katrina.
And I am Anny.
And I'm lucky enough to still be able to be face-to-face with Anny here in Houston. And we wanted to take some time to talk about bilingual assessment today. And before we jump into it, I want to provide a little bit of information about why we're talking about bilingual assessment. So Anny and I have been lucky enough to be talking to a lot of speech pathologists through phone interviews across the U.S., and we've been asking them some questions about bilingual assessment. What they do for bilingual assessment, how does their assessment process change, and it's been really interesting for us because we've been finding that a lot of people are struggling with bilingual assessment. The good thing that we found is that SLPs and all of you guys out there are really trying to figure out when you're assessing a child that's bilingual, is this somebody that's still learning English and learning language, or is this something, is this a child with a language disorder? And we think that that's great, right, Anny, to have that question up front?
Now you know these two things, and that is a big change for the field. It's something that 10 years ago wasn't so clear for people. When I was doing my PhD, that wasn't so clear for people. And we feel that now that's quite clear. But still, we see that people struggle with, no, but what do I do? What am I doing that is okay? And maybe I know I'm not doing everything I need to be doing, right?
Right. So now that people have the foundational knowledge, people want to know where to go. How should I plan my bilingual assessment? What are the best practices? What should I be looking for? And these are all really amazing questions that you should be asking, and we're so happy that SLPs are asking. So that is kind of what brought us to this video today, and so we wanted to take the time in this video to talk about the do's and don'ts. What are some things that you should do when you're planning your bilingual assessment, and what are some things that you should stray away from in that bilingual assessment?
Correct. So let's start, where should we start? With the do's or with the don'ts? Or try to avoid?
Let's start with the tries to avoid, and then that will feed into our do's.
Okay, perfect. So let's see. Something that I still see in clinical practice that I can clearly recommend that we should stop using or to stop doing it is sometimes in clinical practice we are still using standardized testings that are designed for English-speaking children to evaluate bilingual children.
And so that's something to really avoid. You need to check in that testing manual to look at that demographic information, and if these are tests that were standardized and the normative population does not match that bilingual child, that's not really an assessment that you can trust in, that you can think is valid or is going to be diagnostically accurate for you.
Correct. And not only that, right? Like we used to see that people will administer an English testing only, for example, and use the standard scores. But now, since some people think that because the child speaks two languages, that maybe you should allow the child to provide some answers in Spanish. I'm going to tell you all the different things that I have seen. Some people say, okay, let's administer some items in Spanish, even though the question was standardized in English and the target was meant for English-speaking children. So that completely eliminates all the validity of the standardization of the tool.
So it's not only thinking about, is the normative sample appropriate for who I'm testing, but it's also looking at not modifying test items in either the way that you administer them or even in the accepted response and what you're giving points or not giving points for.
And I understand why people do it, right? Like I understand the need of still trying to find an assessment tool for bilingual children. And if you think about Spanish, English, now we have a lot of Spanish tests that are assessing in Spanish available, but if you think about other languages that are growing in the United States, they are not as available, right?
And so are there any other kind of practices that you have seen in bilingual assessment that you would try to avoid?
Yes, I think another one that is important to try to avoid is use vocabulary tests to identify children with language impairments.
And why is that? I think that's interesting because that might be somebody's good go to, especially for maybe receptive language to kind of go to, something that you think might be easy to administer? So why not
And
use
some
those
people also
vocabulary
think
tests?
vocabulary is so important for doing well in school that it should be something that we target. So you should definitely be assessing vocabulary. But when you assess the vocabulary of a bilingual child, you need to assess both language and take both scores into consideration. So if you bring my children that you saw in a previous episode, and you only give them a test in English, those children are gonna look like they have such a low vocabulary, right? And if you give them a test in Spanish, they're gonna do well, but probably there are gonna be some words that they are missing. What happens with we bilinguals is that we have sort of certain words that we know in one language and certain words that we know in another language. And that is particularly important in school. So for example, when I was doing my research, things that I thought were very common for me to ask in Spanish. So that even I myself was biased to this, right? As shapes. You know what shape is this? And I was referring to a cuadrado, to a square. The child will tell me the word in English and they will not know the academic word in Spanish. Of course, these are words that are in the English vocabulary, right? And I should not penalize that child because he doesn't know that word in Spanish. So when we are assessing bilingual children in vocabulary, we should take into account both languages. So if you do that with standardized assessing for monolingual children, typically developing children can have both languages in the 70 percentile and be completely normal.
Wow, that's a really interesting kind of cutoff.
Not in the 70 percentile, but scores in the 70s, in the standard scores, and be completely normal. So even though both languages are low, it's still a typically developing child.
So I think that's some of the bigger kind of things to avoid.
Two big things to not try
that we've seen. And so, of course, we always want to give you things that you should do or you should be thinking about and implementing. So what are some do's? What are some do's for that bilingual assessment?
I know it's hard. I know my recommendation sounds like you can never do it. That is impossible. That is so hard. You need to talk to the principal. You need to get different resources. You really need to provide these bilingual children with assessment in both languages. It's the only way.
And you need to look and analyze both languages together, correct?
Yes.
In order to provide that accurate diagnosis, and so that you can feel in your gut that you've done the best assessment and that you've collected all of the right information. It does need to come from both languages.
Yeah, correct. So you need to have information from both languages. And for children to be identified as language impaired, we know that the child needs to perform low in both languages. So you know this. A child cannot be language impaired in only one of the languages. Therefore, you need testing in both languages. Should I tell them about what happened to the child that I tested as part of my research project?
I think that would be a really good example to illustrate what we're talking about here.
Right. So of course I'm not going to give names, but we found this child as part of a big research project I was conducting. I was trying to select children or to invite children to participate who will potentially have language disorders, but really we were testing children who were bilingual in the study, right? So we invited all the bilingual children who we knew, it was reported that they spoke Spanish. Sometimes the easiest way for the schools to do this is to identify the children that go for 2 ESL classes, right? These children are receiving support for ESL class. So we have this specific child who was part of our research protocol. We do different sessions and we have different testers to make sure that every child is given the right opportunity to be tested in the language. And we realized that this child who was receiving ESL services didn't speak any Spanish.
That was the most interesting thing. Somebody in ESL who's not learning English as a second language because they're clearly a dominant English speaker.
Not only a dominant English speaker, this child could not have a conversation, couldn't complete a TVAP, which is the PPPT version of in Spanish. This child didn't know any Spanish. So you're wondering like, wow, that doesn't happen.
So why was that child then in ESL with only really an English background?
So usually what happens is when the parents did speak some Spanish, this child had a Hispanic last name. When he entered the school, you need to identify what languages are being spoken in Spanish at home, and parents, I am assuming the parents say that the child spoke in Spanish at home. Once that happens, what needs to happen in the school is that child is evaluated in English. to see if he qualifies for ESL, right?
Mm-hmm.
For English, what's it, ESL?
English is a second language
language
learner.
learners, right? Or ELLs are called in some other states. Anyway, so to qualify, to see if the child qualifies for specific services in English, in this particular child, the child didn't pass the test, didn't speak enough English. But it was not because this child was bilingual. It was because this child actually has a severe language disorder that no one has caught before.
And that's the worst case scenario that I'm sure as you're watching it kind of makes your heart or your stomach kind of drop. And that's why we're doing this, to talk about what are those best practices so we can start to eliminate those cases.
So don't wait, right? So don't wait until the child, after 3-4 years, a lot of the approaches are just wait. If there is a child, I think children need to receive, if there is any sign of worry, these children need to receive an evaluation in both languages. Okay?
And so then what is the big picture? What can people take away so that they can start planning better bilingual assessments?
So we know from research findings that for a child to have a language impairment, a bilingual child to have a language impairment, these children will show deficits in both languages.
And because of that,
we need to assess
in both languages.
Absolutely.
And we really want to be starting a conversation with everybody who is watching our videos. Mm-hmm. We want to know, what are your questions, what's working, what's not working, what you're doing right now as part of your bilingual assessment. So what do you think are some of those ways that we can really start that conversation with people?
Why don't you send us an email to
thebigpicturevlog@gmail.com.
You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel.
You could also leave us a comment on any one of our YouTube channels. We do respond. And you can also be a part of our Facebook community at the Big Picture Vlog right on Facebook. You'll get notifications when we have new videos. You can post directly to the page to let us know your thoughts, your feelings, and your comments.
And if you want to stay anonymous and you don't want people to know about your question, you can also email us, and we'll post your question as without any identifying information and see whether people react and what feedback we can give you.
And of course, we hope that this is helping you. We hope that you're finding this useful and it's giving you great tools to use in your clinical practice. And if you are finding this useful, please subscribe. Share this video vlog and let your friends or colleagues know about us so they can come and join the Big Picture community as well. And thank you so much for joining us. And remember to keep on thinking about the big picture.